Ever cut someone off and never looked back? Right, I did, if so.
Imagine being thousands of miles away, caught in the monotony of a quiet deployment, when a message lands in your inbox like a grenade that doesn't make a sound until it has already ripped through everything you thought you could count on. That was the day I learned that my brother had run off with my wife and that they were not just sneaking around or testing the waters of betrayal, but openly moving into the home I had grown up in, the house my parents still lived in. As if their little love story deserved a family blessing while my world fell apart halfway across the globe. I had left home with a kiss from the woman who swore she would wait, and with the nod of a brother who said he'd look out for her, and it turned out that both promises dissolved before the dust even settled on my boots overseas. At first I thought it had to be some mistake, maybe an exaggerated rumor. People gossip, and military wives are often targets of the kind of whispers meant to stir trouble. But the proof wasn't vague or questionable. It was photographs, plain and raw, sent by a friend who didn't even know how to soften the blow. They were sitting in my parents' kitchen, drinking coffee out of my mother's favorite cups, with my father at the table smiling like nothing about the situation was rotten. I remember staring at the grainy image, thinking that if betrayal had a smell, it would be the familiar scent of that kitchen, the place where I once snuck cookies after school. Instead, it was now the backdrop for the demolition of my marriage and the burial ground of what I thought was family loyalty. You'd expect a family to be furious at such a mess, to tell the pair of them they had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. But when I finally got the chance to speak to my parents, their reaction was so mild it made me wonder if I had lost my mind. My father cleared his throat and said, almost apologetically, that things happen and that it was best to keep the peace. My mother didn't even pretend to take my side. She told me flat out that family comes first and that I needed to let it go because people fall in love in strange ways. It was like I was supposed to nod, swallow the betrayal, and act like Thanksgiving dinner could still be eaten under the same roof without choking on every bite. The worst part wasn't even losing my wife. Her love had been eroding for years, though I hadn't wanted to admit it. It was the expectation that I should be the one to absorb the wreckage, carry it silently, and still show up smiling at birthdays as if nothing had happened. That demand, that command disguised as advice, burned hotter than anything else. My parents had a talent for pretending neutrality, but in their eagerness to smooth things over, they revealed exactly whose side they were on. It wasn't mine. It never really had been, if I'm honest. My brother had always been the golden boy, the one who could mess up, crash a car, fail a class, and still be treated as if the sun rose and set on his smile. I was the one who worked, endured, served, and sacrificed, and somehow none of it weighed as much in their eyes as his charm did. I didn't confront them right away. I learned a long time ago that if you scream your anger too early, people tune out and then they paint you as the bitter one, the problem. So I bit down on the bitterness like it was a coin between my teeth, and I smiled through phone calls that felt like interrogations disguised as casual chats. My mother would slip in questions about whether I had spoken to my wife, whether I had thought about rebuilding trust, as though trust could be rebuilt on soil salted with betrayal. I answered with vague words, noncommittal tones, and stored away every remark they made like bullets I'd fire when the time was right. There's something darkly funny about the way people expect betrayal to be absorbed. They act like the wounded party has a duty to rise above it, to show grace, to become the bigger person. What no one talks about is how that grace tastes like ashes when you swallow it, how being the bigger person often just means being the one who walks away empty-handed while everyone else laughs at the mess they've left you with. I knew I wasn't going to walk away quietly. I wasn't built for martyrdom, and I wasn't about to let my brother's story of finding true love at my expense play out without consequences. The first crack in their illusion came sooner than they realized. When my brother tried to get access to one of the savings accounts that had both his and my name on it from an old business venture, he assumed I would sign off just to keep things clean. He didn't expect me to send back a simple refusal, no explanation, no apology, just the blunt denial of access. It wasn't much, but it was enough to remind him and my parents that I wasn't going to be their silent casualty. My father called me the next day, his voice heavy with disappointment, not at my brother for what he had done, but at me for making things difficult. That was the moment I stopped seeing them as family in the way I used to. Blood ties, shared meals, the framed photographs on the walls, none of it meant what it had before. My parents had drawn their line in the sand, and they expected me to cross over and stand beside them. Instead, I stood still. And as I hung up the phone on my father's side, I felt the first flicker of something that almost resembled satisfaction. They thought they could write me into the role of the quiet, forgiving daughter, the one who takes the hit so the family name doesn't get scratched. But I had already chosen a different script. And while I hadn't yet mapped out the full shape of my revenge, I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't going to let this betrayal slide into history as just another family scandal we never talked about. No, I was going to make sure every single one of them remembered exactly what it cost to make me the villain in a story I never asked to be part of. The morning my parents showed up at my door with that carefully neutral expression they use when they expect me to be reasonable, I had already been awake for hours, pacing between the kitchen counter and the front window while the coffee turned gritty and sour in the pot, rehearsing lines that sounded calm in my head but kept catching on the edges of my anger because there is nothing calm about being told to swallow humiliation like a vitamin and smile through it for the sake of Sunday dinners. They didn't knock the way people knock when they know they're intruding. They knocked like landlords, knuckles crisp and entitled, and when I opened, my mother stepped in before I even moved, her perfume first, her smile second. And the sentence she had probably practiced in the car third. We all need to move forward, as if forward were a place you could book a ticket to without checking what got crushed under the wheels on the way there. I let them sit at the tiny table I bought secondhand right after basic, the one with the faint ring stains that never quite scrub out, and while my father stirred sugar into his mug as if sugar could fix anything, my mother started her speech about forgiveness. About how love does not follow rules, about how my brother and my wife hadn't planned this, and how, if I was honest, maybe the marriage had been struggling, which landed like a neat little accusation dressed up as empathy. I could feel the old family choreography trying to pull me back into my assigned role, the reliable daughter who handles her own feelings quietly while the family's delicate equilibrium gets protected, so I sat on my hands to keep from gesturing too much, because I didn't want to give them the satisfaction of calling me dramatic, and I listened until my mother's voice softened into that last pitch where she always expects me to say yes. I told them I understood the urge to pretend nothing catastrophic had happened because pretending keeps you from cleaning up the mess, and I told them I had spent nights counting what I had lost. Not just a partner and a home, but the illusion that my brother would choose decency when it mattered, and that I had arrived at a conclusion none of us liked. If family comes first, means the one who stayed faithful has to set herself on fire to keep everyone else warm, then the phrase is not a value. It is a weapon. My father sighed, the kind of sigh that says you're being exhausting for refusing to be the sacrificial goat with good posture, and he asked whether I could at least try to be civil for the sake of peace. And I said I could absolutely be civil because civility is my specialty, it just won't look like letting them live rent-free in my head or my accounts. That was the moment I switched from defense to offense, gently, almost sweetly, like placing a napkin over your lap before you start cutting into something tough. I asked my father how his truck was running and he said fine, and I nodded and said that reminded me, the insurance policy he enjoys has my name at the top because I covered him when his rates spiked after that little incident on the freeway. And while I am not canceling anything today, I wanted to give him notice that I am auditing what I fund and what I won't, because accountability, like charity, should start at home. My mother blinked twice, the old blink of someone doing the math of favors given and leverage lost, and moved quickly to safer ground by asking whether I would attend Sunday dinner to clear the air, which was her way of promising an ambush with casseroles. I told her I would think about it, and I meant it, because sometimes you accept an ambush if you need a stage, and while they stood up and smoothed their coats as if smoothing their arguments, I walked them to the door and said I hoped their afternoon was peaceful, which is what you say when you already know it won't be. When the door closed, I put down the coffee I hadn't touched and pulled out the small binder I keep in the hall closet, the one where I file every document that can hurt me or save me, and I laid out titles, policies, passwords written in careful block letters. A map of my life people had mistaken for silence, because I don't wave it in their faces. The car my wife drove because her commute was longer was, on paper and in every database that matters, mine, insured by me, with a spare key inside a taped envelope at the bottom of my sock drawer labeled with a boring word so no one would think to look. And when betrayal guzzles fuel on your dime, the cleanest response is to stop filling the tank. That evening, while the sky sagged into that flat gray that feels like a held breath, I took a rideshare to my parents' street and walked the last block on foot because I didn't need a stranger to witness this, and I didn't need headlights announcing me like a parade. My brother's laughter floated from the porch, that careless laugh that used to get him out of trouble in high school when he broke rules with cheerful confidence, and I moved past the hydrangeas my mother babies all summer, down the side path where the driveway narrows. And there it was, the sedan with the familiar scratch on the rear bumper and the air freshener my wife liked dangling in the window like a joke about minty sins. I did not hesitate. The key turned as easily as it did the day I picked the car up from the lot, the engine hummed with the same polite enthusiasm, and I slid into the driver's seat with the calm that comes from choosing action over speeches. I drove it to the base lot I still have access to as a reservist, parked it under a camera, signed the guest log for good measure, and texted my wife a single line from a number she doesn't recognize anymore. Your car is safe, paperwork is not. Because there are times when a breadcrumb trail is more effective than an explosion, and the message did exactly what it was supposed to do, which is make her run laps in her own head, while she tries to figure out what else I have already moved, frozen, redirected, or reclaimed. By the time I walked back to my place, my phone was chiming with missed calls from numbers I could identify by rhythm alone, my mother's anxious double ring, my brother's impatient buzz, my father's single long tone like a lecture warming up. And I put the phone face down on the counter and let the silence grow teeth, because silence is not surrender when you are the one who set the terms. The next morning, an envelope slid under my door with my mother's handwriting on the front and a note inside that said Sunday dinner at 6. Please come ready to be kind, and beneath that, in my father's block letters, a reminder that good families do not air dirty laundry, which made me smile in spite of myself, because I had just discovered how much lighter you feel when you finally separate what is yours to carry from what other people dumped in your hands. I folded the note, slipped it into the binder with the rest of my documents, and told myself that I would go, not for reconciliation, but for the kind of civility that comes with bright lights and a sharpened memory. Because if Sunday dinner is going to be a tribunal disguised as a roast, I am more than ready to be sworn in. And as I locked the door behind me and headed to work, my phone pinged with a new message from an unknown number containing a single sentence that made me stop in the stairwell and grip the banister until the wood pressed crescents into my palm. If you bring the car back, we can talk like adults, which told me that my little reminder had hit harder than expected, and that the next move, the one I had been saving for the end of the first act, had arrived sooner. And I would need to decide whether Sunday dinner would be a negotiation or a stage for the first real public fracture, because either way, someone was going to choke on the word family. The Sunday dinner my parents had orchestrated under the guise of reconciliation was the kind of event that drips with pretense, where every gesture, every dish, and every comment is measured to convey civility while hiding the undercurrent of judgment and expectation. And I arrived prepared to navigate the minefield with the poise of someone who has long ago accepted that family gatherings are rarely about love and often about control. As I stepped through the front door, the aroma of roast and buttered vegetables filled the air like a familiar trap, and my brother, standing near the fireplace with that infuriatingly smug smile that had once charmed teachers and neighbors alike, nodded at me as though my presence was merely a formality, a box to tick in his ongoing performance of innocence, while my wife lingered near the buffet, pretending not to notice the tightening in my chest, her eyes flicking toward me with that mix of fear and calculation that only comes when someone realizes their story is unraveling in real time. I greeted my parents politely, careful to keep the edge out of my voice, because civility is the most dangerous weapon when wielded correctly. And I could feel the tension coil around the room as I took my seat opposite the pair who had chosen allegiance over justice, who had made it clear that in their eyes, My brother's betrayal was a trivial inconvenience, while my outrage was a problem that needed correction. Conversation began with innocuous topics, sports and weather and work, but the undertone was unmistakable, a silent contest to see who would crack first, and I participated with just enough engagement to appear harmless while observing every twitch, every glance, every pause that betrayed the pretense. My brother tried to engage me directly, asking how deployment had been, assuming he could elicit either humility or guilt, but I responded with neutral answers that hinted at resilience without giving away strategy. Because I had learned that the most effective revenge often begins with patience, letting the other party believe they are in control while you map every move they make. As the main course was served, I began to plant subtle seeds, the kind of conversational breadcrumbs that seem innocent at first, but grow into uncomfortable questions when left to fester. Casually remarking on topics my brother and wife might have considered private, referencing deadlines, payments, and obligations they had neglected, all phrased in the lightest tone, almost like idle chat, but carrying the weight of evidence and memory that could unravel their carefully constructed narrative. My mother tried to intervene with gentle reminders about manners and hospitality, but I continued, letting the words slip into the room with the ease of air, and I could see the flicker of recognition in my brother's eyes. The microsecond where he realized that the daughter he had underestimated, the wife he had deceived, was fully aware of the cracks and ready to exploit them with precision. I did not rise to the bait of anger. That would have been obvious and easily dismissed as emotional reaction, so I leaned into subtlety, bringing up minor financial entanglements, overdue bills, and obligations in a way that suggested curiosity rather than accusation, watching as my wife shifted uncomfortably, as if the very air reminded her that the safety net she had assumed existed was disappearing under her feet. My father cleared his throat more than once, attempting to steer the conversation back to safer territory, but every time he spoke, I redirected gently, framing each statement as if it were concern for the family's overall well-being, making it impossible for them to call me hostile without exposing themselves as complicit in ignoring responsibility, and I realized in that moment that strategy, like a well-set trap, does not require noise to be effective. The quiet accumulation of pressure is far more potent. Dessert arrived, a delicate pie my mother insisted was her specialty, and I used the transition to bring in a final, subtle maneuver, casually inquiring whether they had considered how intertwined accounts, keys, and leases were affected by the recent moves, framing it as curiosity rather than confrontation, letting them squirm under the weight of facts they had assumed I would overlook, and I noticed my brother's jaw tighten, his fingers drumming nervously against the table, a rhythm betraying his rising panic masked by an outwardly calm demeanor. My wife, who had once looked so confident in her deception, now looked like a chess piece cornered, and I allowed myself a small internal acknowledgement that patience was a weapon I wielded better than any anger-fueled outburst. When the dinner concluded, my parents insisted on lingering with polite farewells, murmuring about the importance of family unity, while I smiled and nodded, internally cataloging each slip, each unease, each silent acknowledgement of fear that had crossed their faces, and as I walked out to the night air that smelled of damp leaves and cold asphalt, I felt the weight of control shift subtly, irreversibly, toward me, because every subtle remark, every carefully placed question, and every deliberate pause had sown the seeds of doubt and unease that would grow long after the last fork was put down, and I knew that the next move, the escalation that would force their hand, was no longer a matter of if, but when. Because the veneer of civility I had maintained during the meal had already cracked, revealing the first glimpses of a reckoning that would be both quiet and devastating. By the time I returned to my apartment, the quiet hum of the city around me felt like a canvas on which I could paint the next act, and I allowed myself a brief smile knowing that the evening had gone exactly as I intended. I had not confronted. I had not lost my composure, and yet the fracture lines were visible, faint at first, but undeniable, and the knowledge that they were already beginning to question, to second-guess, and to fear the consequences of their own choices gave me the first taste of satisfaction that would soon turn into carefully executed retribution, because in a game of betrayal, The one who waits, observes, and calculates always holds the power and the stage for the next act, where patience would give way to precision, was already set in motion. The days following that first dinner were a delicate, tense dance, a choreography of observation and patience that required every ounce of my attention and the discipline to conceal the storm that roared just beneath my calm exterior. Because I knew that every conversation, every casual meeting, every shared glance within the family could either reveal my strategy prematurely or strengthen the foundation upon which I was quietly building a form of justice that they had no inkling I intended to deliver. I spent hours reviewing bank statements, contracts, and personal correspondences that had once been dormant, files that my brother and my wife had assumed were irrelevant to their plans, and with each line I examined, I began to see the patterns they left behind, the small inconsistencies in their stories, the overlooked details that exposed their overconfidence. And I realized that betrayal of this scale often leaves the most valuable clues precisely where people think they are hidden. I started with the smallest moves, testing reactions and measuring anxiety with the precision of a surgeon, sending subtle messages through mutual contacts, arranging meetings that appeared casual but carried information only I could verify, and orchestrating situations in which they would confront their own lies without realizing that I was pulling the strings. I visited the local library under the guise of research, accessed public records to verify property lines, loan agreements, and vehicle registrations, and quietly cross-referenced everything with the details I already possessed, building a web of leverage so intricate that if I chose to, I could unravel their lives one layer at a time without raising suspicion that the architect of their discomfort was sitting just a few blocks away, pretending to sip coffee and read a book while the clock ticked inexorably toward exposure. It was during one of these quiet reconnaissance periods that I received an unexpected message from a friend who had previously worked with my wife on a charity event. A simple note stating that there were questions being raised about the allocation of funds and about the timelines reported for volunteer work, questions that had once seemed trivial, but now, placed against the backdrop of betrayal and deceit, were explosive in their potential, and I understood immediately that I could turn this information into a public embarrassment that would reach not only my brother and his accomplice, but also the parents who had so casually dismissed my feelings. Because those who shielded wrongdoing often find themselves unprepared when the truth arrives wearing the guise of coincidence. I began planning the next family gathering, not to attend as the reconciliatory daughter, but as an observer with a carefully curated arsenal of revelations, prepared to nudge the situation toward discomfort without overt confrontation. Because true power and revenge lies in allowing others to expose themselves, to stumble over their own missteps while you remain untouched. And in that calculus, civility becomes a weapon, patience becomes strategy, and observation becomes the blueprint for dismantling the carefully constructed facade of normalcy. Each conversation I engineered, each question I asked in passing, was designed to provoke subtle shifts in behavior, minor betrayals of composure that, when multiplied, would erode the confidence of my brother and his partner and force my parents to reckon with the consequences of having turned a blind eye to what they had chosen to label family loyalty. The tension built as I orchestrated indirect confrontations, dropping hints of my awareness about financial mismanagement, unpaid bills, and overlooked legal responsibilities, all couched in the casual, polite tone that my parents had always expected me to maintain, and I watched from a distance as cracks began to appear, micro-expressions betraying unease, shifts in posture revealing that my presence alone had become a catalyst for anxiety. And I felt the first true thrill of control, knowing that their carefully constructed lives were beginning to wobble under the weight of their own miscalculations. In parallel, I began arranging opportunities to reclaim what had been lost without their knowledge, transferring access to accounts that had been assumed secure, securing documentation that proved the extent of their deceptions, and preparing evidence that would make their manipulations impossible to ignore, because revenge, when executed with precision, does not require theatrics. It requires patience, accuracy, and the relentless accumulation of power until the moment comes when the balance irrevocably shifts. The culmination of these efforts was a family gathering that they had believed would be routine, where the appearance of normalcy masked the carefully planted evidence that I had scattered throughout conversations, notes, and social interactions, so that when the inevitable moment of exposure arrived, the impact would be multiplied, not by anger, not by shouting, but by the quiet, undeniable logic of truth. And as I prepared to step into that evening, knowing that the first public fractures of their narrative were imminent, I allowed myself a brief, private smile, understanding that patience, meticulous planning, and strategic silence had brought me to the threshold of a reckoning that would leave no one untouched. And that the moment they realized the scope of what I knew, the world they had believed controlled would tilt irrevocably in my favor. The moment I had been preparing for, the culmination of months spent observing, documenting, and quietly manipulating the circumstances around my family, finally arrived with a precision that made every step feel inevitable, as if the universe itself had aligned to ensure that the reckoning would unfold not as a spectacle of rage, but as a methodical, undeniable exposition of truth that could no longer be ignored or dismissed. And as I walked into the house that had once been my refuge and had become the stage for betrayal, I carried with me the weight of every detail, every document, every subtle maneuver that had built an unassailable case of exposure without ever revealing the architect behind it. The family was gathered in the living room, my parents stationed like neutral referees in their self-assigned roles, my brother seated with a forced nonchalance that failed to disguise the tension coiling in his shoulders, and my wife perched on the edge of the couch as if her presence alone could shield her from the consequences I had so carefully assembled. They all expected a confrontation defined by emotion, by anger or tears, and they were immediately unsettled when I spoke with a calm and deliberate cadence, narrating events and facts as though I were recounting a story to strangers, stripping each moment of hyperbole, leaving only the raw, undeniable evidence of their choices and missteps. I began with the financials, exposing discrepancies in the accounts that my brother had assumed he could access freely, revealing the transfers and locks I had executed silently, demonstrating that his sense of entitlement was no longer a shield but a liability. And as each detail unfolded, I observed the subtle reactions, my mother's hands tightening on her knees, my father's throat clearing as if searching for authority that had evaporated, and my brother's jaw clenching, the faint tremor in his fingers betraying the panic he had been trained to conceal, while my wife's eyes darted toward the floor, avoiding the knowledge that she had underestimated the scope of my awareness and underestimated the patience that had honed my strategy. I moved carefully, shifting the narrative from financial control to personal deception, recounting instances where promises had been broken, timelines altered, and trust manipulated, all delivered with the calm clarity of someone presenting facts to a court, without accusation, without drama, allowing the weight of truth to press upon them more effectively than any shout could. And I could feel the room changing as the veneer of normalcy began to crumble under the steady pressure of meticulously revealed realities, forcing them to confront the consequences of their decisions in real time while I maintained the appearance of measured detachment. The brilliance of calculated revenge lies in timing, in the ability to escalate pressure subtly while remaining ostensibly harmless, and as I guided the discussion toward the social and reputational implications of their actions, exposing how their choices had affected friends, neighbors, and even professional contacts, I watched my brother's composure fracture in small increments, my wife's attempts at justification faltering with each logical contradiction, and my parents' attempts to mediate, revealing less about their authority and more about their complicity, as they realized that the shields they had placed between their children and accountability were proving ineffective against the precision of preparation and the relentless application of truth. I allowed the silence that followed my summary to stretch, watching them absorb the full breadth of their miscalculations, feeling a profound satisfaction not in cruelty, but in the equilibrium being restored in a manner that they could not manipulate. And then, without raising my voice or gesturing with excess, I revealed the final detail, the masterstroke of my patient campaign, the documentation of their collective negligence and endorsement of deceit, compiled into a format that left no ambiguity, no room for denial, and as I slid the folder across the table, their eyes widened in recognition, understanding that the narrative they had assumed under control was now fully visible, immutable, and entirely within my power to reveal to anyone I chose. The room erupted not in chaos, but in stunned recognition, as my brother muttered under his breath, my wife's lips parted in disbelief, and my parents exchanged glances that communicated the shock of realizing they had misjudged the extent of my preparation and the seriousness of my resolve. And as I stood, carefully placing each piece of evidence in the center of the table, I spoke with deliberate calm, reminding them that loyalty is not blind, that family comes with responsibilities, and that betrayal, no matter how cleverly disguised, carries consequences. And with those words, I turned and left the house, not looking back, not offering forgiveness, and leaving them with the stark, unalterable reality of their choices. Walking into the night, the cool air pressing against my skin felt like a liberation I had not known I was capable of, and though the echoes of the confrontation would linger in the halls of the house, in the minds of my brother and my wife, and in the conscience of my parents, I knew that I had achieved what they believed impossible, a reckoning that honored truth without losing dignity, that reclaimed control over what was mine, and that left the final question unresolved, not for lack of clarity, but because the power of ambiguity is in allowing them to wonder endlessly whether reconciliation is possible, whether forgiveness could be earned, and whether the family they thought they commanded has, in fact, been irrevocably changed by the patient, deliberate, and unyielding force of one person's refusal to be invisible in the aftermath of betrayal.